let's take this seriously for a moment. This idea that resourcefulness begins when you stop waiting and start solving. What does that actually mean? It means that the act of waiting, which is often disguised as preparation or prudence, can become a sophisticated form of avoidance. It's the illusion of movement without motion. People wait for clarity. They wait for motivation. They wait for someone to tell them what to do. But the problem is life doesn't offer certainty. It offers opportunity wrapped in chaos. And if you're always waiting for everything to align perfectly, you're going to miss every meaningful door that ever opens. You have to understand, the mind is a pattern recognition machine. When you practice passivity, you wire your brain to freeze in the face of uncertainty. You teach yourself helplessness, and then you call it being realistic, but it's not realism. It's fear rationalized into paralysis. On the other hand, solving, acting, rewires the entire system. When you're faced with a problem and you make a move, even a small one, you take the abstract and make it concrete. You transform fear into feedback. That's how resourcefulness is built, not by knowledge alone, but by the willing exposure to challenge and the decision to engage with it. And look, you don't need all the tools to get started. You don't need perfect timing or a flawless plan. What you need is the capacity to say, I'll figure it out as I go. That mindset is the seed of competence. Think about it this way. We admire people not because they knew everything, but because they dared anyway. They moved forward in the fog with partial information and trusted that they gained the skills through necessity. That's how most innovation happens. That's how most growth occurs. You get thrown into the deep end, and instead of drowning, you learn to swim, not because you're ready, but because you're willing. And there's something psychologically transformative about that. When you stop outsourcing your decisions, when you stop blaming the world or waiting for conditions to be ideal, you come into contact with something very powerful, your own potential. And it terrifies you, because it makes you realize that most of the limits you've lived under were chosen, not imposed. So resourcefulness, this isn't a personality trait. It's a discipline, a moral obligation even, because life will test you. Chaos will come. And when it does, the question isn't, do I have the resources? The question is, can I become the person who finds them? You stop waiting. You start solving. And in doing so, you become someone formidable, someone who doesn't crumble under pressure, but adapts, reconfigures, and moves forward regardless. That's not just a strategy, that's a philosophy of life. Let's explore this idea. Your words shape your resilience. That may seem like a soft observation, perhaps even a motivational cliche, but it is in fact a psychologically rigorous truth. The language you use internally, your self-talk, your narrative structure, acts as a blueprint for how you process suffering, handle pressure, and interpret your place in the world. Now consider this, the brain doesn't operate merely on raw data, it operates on meaning, and meaning is mediated through language. When you say to yourself, I can't handle this, what you're doing neurologically is reinforcing a pathway of helplessness. You're not just describing reality, you're creating it. You're shaping your perception of capacity, and that perception becomes your lived experience. And it's subtle, it's insidious. People say things like, I'm just not good with stress, or I've always been anxious, or I never finish what I start. Those aren't facts, those are identity statements, verbalized assumptions about the self that get internalized as truth. And once internalized, they become self-fulfilling prophecies. But here's the critical distinction. That script running in your mind is not immutable, it's not carved into your being. It can be challenged, it can be rewritten. And that's where the discipline comes in, not just of thinking differently, but of speaking differently to yourself. You begin by interrogating the script. Who taught you to talk to yourself that way? Where did that voice come from? A parent, a teacher, a string of failures that you never contextualized properly? Because the story you're telling yourself might not be your story at all. It might be inherited, and worse, inaccurate. So what does it mean to flip the script? It means you replace resignation with inquiry. Instead of, I can't, you say, how can I? Instead of, I always mess this up, you say, what am I missing and how can I improve? That shift isn't just semantic, it's foundational. It places you in the role of an active agent, not a passive victim. And psychologically, that's everything. Language is not neutral. It is directive. It aims you somewhere. If your inner dialogue is filled with self-doubt, avoidance, catastrophizing, then don't be surprised when your behavior reflects that chaos. But if your words reflect curiosity, responsibility, and courage, even in the smallest amounts, you begin to rewire the very machinery that determines your resilience. Now, this isn't about blind optimism or repeating empty affirmations. That's superficial. This is about aligning your internal dialogue with your highest potential rather than your worst fears. It's about speaking truth, useful truth, into your own mind. Because when you change your words, you don't just change your thoughts, you change your posture, you change your decisions, you change how you interpret suffering. And that is the essence of resilience, not the absence of hardship, but the refusal to be diminished by it. You flip the script, and in doing so, you rewrite your reality. Let's take this idea seriously. Progress over perfection is the rule. Messy action wins. Because, frankly, perfectionism is a lie. It masquerades as a high standard, a noble aim, but in truth, it is paralysis dressed up as virtue. Perfectionism doesn't drive excellence. It prevents it. It's a defense mechanism, an elegant excuse to avoid the terrifying act of starting. Perfection says, don't try unless you're guaranteed success. But that is a catastrophic way to structure your life. Why? Because life doesn't reward the perfect. It rewards the persistent. It rewards the person who moves forward, stumbles, recalibrates, and moves again. The pursuit of perfection assumes that there's a clean linear path to mastery. But that assumption is false. All real development, intellectual, emotional, moral, is nonlinear. It is clumsy. It is chaotic. It is full of regression and uncertainty. And it has to be, because progress involves friction. If there is no resistance, then you are not growing. You're rehearsing comfort, not confronting the unknown. And here's the trap. People wait for the perfect moment to act, to speak, to begin. But the perfect moment doesn't exist. There is only now, flawed, incomplete, but available. If you wait until your plan is flawless, until your confidence is total, you will be waiting for the rest of your life. Perfection is a fantasy. It's control-based thinking in a world that guarantees none. Now, messy action. This is the antidote. It's the act of stepping forward despite the lack of clarity. It's deciding that doing something poorly is infinitely more productive than doing nothing flawlessly. You start the project before you know how it ends. You speak before your voice is steady. You write the page before you know what the chapter is about. This kind of action is not naive, it is deeply courageous because it requires you to accept imperfection, not as a failure, but as a necessary step in competence. And more than that, it forces humility. You have to admit what you don't know. You have to tolerate the discomfort of looking foolish. But that's how you learn. You expose the gaps in your knowledge, not to shame yourself, but to locate exactly what must be improved. And let's be clear, this doesn't mean you abandon standards. No, quite the opposite. You maintain high standards, but you move toward them iteratively. You adjust, you refine, you adapt. That's how progress works. It is recursive. You do, you reflect, you evolve over and over again. That process of messy, persistent engagement is the mechanism through which potential is transformed into capability. Not once, not instantly, but repeatedly through intentional friction. You don't become resilient by avoiding failure. You become resilient by acting in its presence repeatedly until it no longer threatens your identity. Messy action wins because it's the only thing that ever moves the needle. Perfection is the dream. Progress is the discipline. Would you like the next part broken down into bullet points or performance cues for delivery? Let's examine something that most people find uncomfortable. The right people in your life are not the ones who merely make you feel good. They're the ones who demand that you become better. That's not an easy truth to digest. In fact, it's one most avoid because comfort feels like love and challenge feels like judgment. But that's a misinterpretation with consequences. Comfort has its place, yes, but it should not be the foundation of your relationships. If all your interactions are rooted in affirmation, you will be trapped in a psychological echo chamber where growth becomes impossible. Because growth, by definition, involves discomfort. It involves confronting what is inadequate, undeveloped, or false, often in yourself. Now here's the reality. If you surround yourself with people who always agree with you, who never push back, who allow you to remain small, you are not in a network of support. You are in a web of stagnation. That's not friendship, that's enablement, and it's dangerous because people grow in the presence of pressure. When someone you trust looks you in the eye and says you're capable of more, that can either offend you or awaken you. It depends on whether you're more attached to your ego or to your potential. The right people, true allies, don't coddle your weakness. They expose it, not to humiliate you, but to reveal the next step in your development. They will point out your blind spots, challenge your patterns, and call you out when you compromise your values. And here's the key. They do it because they believe in you. They believe that you are someone who can become more. And they hold you to that higher standard. Not out of cruelty, but out of respect. And that respect is earned because when you allow someone to challenge you, what you're really doing is inviting truth into the room. And truth, real, unvarnished, sometimes painful truth, is the catalyst for transformation. It's what allows you to strip away pretense, defensiveness, and the soft stories you tell yourself to avoid change. But of course, this requires courage on both sides. It takes courage to confront someone you care about and say you're off track. And it takes even more courage to hear that and respond with humility rather than defensiveness. Most people aren't willing to do that. That's why they drift toward relationships that affirm their mediocrity rather than ignite their potential. But if you're serious about becoming more, you must seek out the difficult conversations. You must invite critique. You must give people permission to challenge you, not casually, but constructively and with precision, because iron sharpens iron. And without friction, the edge dulls. So ask yourself, are you surrounded by people who tell you what you want to hear or what you need to hear? Because one path leads to comfort, the other to character. There's a truth that we instinctively know, but spend most of our lives avoiding. Discomfort is the training ground for mental toughness. That isn't a motivational slogan, it's a psychological law. Human beings do not develop strength, discipline, or clarity in environments of ease. They develop it under pressure, under strain, under the weight of responsibility and challenge. And let's be precise here. Discomfort is not simply inconvenience. It's not about being mildly annoyed or slightly tired. Discomfort in the context of growth refers to the voluntary exposure to situations that demand more from you than you think you have. It's the gap between who you are now and who you're required to become in order to overcome something difficult. That gap is painful, but it is also necessary. Most people treat discomfort as a signal to stop. They interpret resistance as a warning sign, when in fact it's a threshold, a signal that you've reached the edge of your current competence, and now you have a choice. Pull back into safety or step forward into struggle. The ones who develop mental toughness aren't the ones who choose ease. They're the ones who move into that friction intentionally, knowing full well it will be hard, but knowing something else too, that on the other side of that difficulty is transformation. Now, why does discomfort build toughness? Because it exposes you. It strips away illusions. When you're uncomfortable, when you're afraid or uncertain or in over your head, you find out very quickly what you're made of. You uncover the fragility of your habits, the instability of your beliefs, and the holes in your discipline. And if you have the humility to observe rather than panic, you gain something invaluable: self-acknowledge. And with that knowledge, you can begin to rebuild yourself, stronger, clearer, and more capable. The tragedy is that we pathologize discomfort. We tell people that if something feels bad, it must be wrong. That's a lie. Growth feels bad. Progress often feels like failure. You can't rewire your brain, recalibrate your emotions, or reorient your habits without discomfort. It's not a side effect of transformation. And here's the difficult part. No one can do it for you. No one can sit in that discomfort on your behalf. It is your responsibility to choose it, to say, this is hard, and I'm doing it anyway. That choice, over and over again, is what builds mental toughness. It's not something you're born with. It's something you forge in the fire of experience, repetition, and personal responsibility. So if you want to become stronger, more disciplined, more resilient, stop running from what makes you uncomfortable. Move toward it, not recklessly, but voluntarily, because within that struggle is the exact pressure needed to shape you into someone formidable. Let's consider a dangerous modern assumption. The idea that you need to feel ready before you can act, that you must be emotionally aligned, inspired, or confident before taking meaningful steps forward. This belief, common, comfortable, and catastrophically false, has paralyzed millions. It's built on the premise that emotion must lead and action must follow. But that is backwards. Here's the problem. Emotions are unstable. They fluctuate with sleep, diet, weather, self-doubt, and memory. They are not fixed coordinates, they are waves. And if you tether your decisions to your emotional state, you'll be at the mercy of forces you don't control. You'll never write the book, launch the business, fix the relationship, or break the addiction, because you'll always be waiting for the right feeling to arrive. But it won't, because action is not the result of readiness, it is the cause. Motion follows motion, not the other way around. When you act and you step forward into uncertainty, even with trembling hands, you activate something fundamental. You disrupt passivity. You take what was abstract and make it concrete. You show yourself that you are not merely a bundle of fears and moods, but a being capable of forward movement. That alone changes your emotional state more than any amount of reflection ever could. And there's deep psychology behind this. When you act, you signal to your brain, this matters, I am engaging. That engagement reduces anxiety, it builds self-trust, it gives chaos form. But when you avoid action, when you delay, ruminate, distract, your anxiety compounds. Your self-respect deteriorates. You begin to view yourself as someone who waits, someone who hesitates. And that identity, subtle but corrosive, takes root. You see, we overestimate the importance of motivation and underestimate the power of commitment. Motivation is fleeting. Commitment is decisive. People who succeed, who build resilience, who transcend their limitations, they act despite how they feel. They act when they're afraid, when they're uncertain, when every instinct tells them to retreat, because they've learned through trial and error that action is the path through fear, not the reward for escaping it. And we must confront this honestly. If you only act when you feel like it, your life will be dictated by moods, not principles. And moods are poor leaders. But if you act according to values, if you say this is difficult and I am doing it anyway, you begin to carve out a different kind of life, one built not on convenience but on conviction. That's what separates those who transform from those who stay stuck. Not talent, not timing, but the repeated decision to move before certainty, to build confidence through action, not as a prerequisite, but as a byproduct. So if you're waiting to feel ready, stop. Readiness is not a prerequisite for courage. Motion is. Step forward and let your emotions catch up later. There's a fundamental truth we often ignore, perhaps because acknowledging it would force us to change. Every moment is a choice, and that choice is not trivial. It's existential. It's the decision to remain trapped in what you've become or to rise toward who you could be. And that's not poetic language. It's reality, defined moment by what you're willing to confront and what you're willing to avoid. Let's get something clear. Being stuck is not just a matter of circumstance. Certainly life hands out hardship unevenly. Some inherit chaos, trauma, instability. Others, order and support. But even so, your response remains yours. And in that space between what happens and what you do about it, that's where your freedom lives. That's where your character is revealed. And it happens in the smallest decisions. You wake up, you're exhausted. You can hit the snooze button again, or you can rise. You receive criticism. Do you defend yourself and sink into bitterness? Or do you listen and learn something difficult but true? You fail. Do you collapse into self-pity, or do you face it head on and figure out what must be done differently? Each of these is a fork in the road, a micro moment. And the path you choose over time shapes not only your direction, but your identity. The person who chooses to rise becomes someone who knows they can rise. The person who stays stuck becomes someone who no longer believes movement is possible. And here's the danger. The longer you choose inaction, the more it becomes a default. You normalize resignation. You justify weakness. You build a belief system around the idea that this stagnation is just the way it is. But that's a lie. It's not that you can't change. It's that you've trained yourself not to choose, but you can retrain that choice. You can begin in the smallest way to assert your will again, to say this hurts, but I will move. Or this is terrifying, but I won't stay here. That decision doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to be repeated. You don't overcome being stuck all at once. You chip away at it, moment, by acting differently than the version of yourself that's been losing. And that's the moral weight of this idea. You're not just choosing behaviors. You're choosing who you are going to become. You're either becoming the person who rises when it's hard, or the one who backs down when it matters most. So the question is not, can I change? The question is, will I choose to? Because right now, in this exact moment, you are at a crossroads. One path is known, comfortable, familiar, but it leads nowhere. The other is uncertain, maybe painful, but it leads somewhere real. Every moment is a choice. Stay stuck or rise. So here we are. 10 truths, 10 challenges, 10 calls to rise above comfort, mediocrity, and fear. And not one of them works unless you do. Because knowledge doesn't change people, action does. You can hear every insight, nod in agreement, underline every quote, but until you confront the hard parts of your own life and begin moving, it's all just noise. You want a resilient, resourceful mindset, then you build it deliberately, brick by brick, by choosing discomfort over ease, responsibility over excuses, movement over hesitation. You build it by acting when it's messy, by listening when it stings, by standing up when you don't feel like it. And let's be honest, it will be hard. You'll fall short, you'll want to quit, but if you keep going, something changes, your default changes, your beliefs change. You start to become someone even you respect, not because life became easier, but because you became stronger. So don't wait, don't scroll past this, don't file it away for later. Later is a myth. Now is the only place anything real happens. You're not stuck, you're not broken, you're not too late. You're just one honest decision away from rising. And this moment, right now, is your chance to make it.